Anthology opening, some stories don't have endings. Most of the stories people send me have some kind of ending. Maybe they find out who was outside the house. Maybe the strange noise turns out to be an animal. Or maybe enough time passes that they can convince themselves it was nothing. These three are different. People who sent them weren't trying to prove anything supernatural happened. In fact, each of them offered their own reasonable explanations. The problem is that none of those explanations ever covered everything. One man still remembers hearing something shift in the sealed space above his bathroom ceiling. One woman still thinks about seeing the same parked vehicle twice on a road where, as far as she could tell, it could not have reached before her. And one father still has no idea how an object nobody in his family recognized ended up underneath his young son's bed. Years have passed since all of this happened. They've moved on mostly. But each story left behind one detail that never settled. By the end, you'll understand why they still remember it so clearly. A cheap apartment that felt like a lucky find. I was 24 when I moved into that apartment, and at the time it felt less like a compromise and more like a reset. I had just come out of a relationship that lasted most of my early 20s, so having a place that was mine mattered more than I expected. The apartment was on the second floor of an old house near the university. The landlord, Mr. Keller, owned a few converted properties in the area and seemed ordinary. The rent was affordable without being suspiciously low, which was probably why I signed the lease so quickly. The place itself was small. The kitchen was barely wide enough for one person to stand between the counter and the stove. And the radiator made sharp little clicking sounds after midnight. The bathroom ceiling sat lower than the ceilings in the other rooms. But I assumed that had something to do with the renovation. There was a laundromat 2 blocks away. And most nights I ate dinner at the kitchen table while watching videos on my laptop because I still hadn't bought a television. The house had once been a single-family home before being divided into apartments decades earlier. While moving in, I noticed a faint rectangular outline in the bathroom ceiling. I asked Mr. Keller about it, said there wasn't an accessible attic on that side. I believed him. First sounds. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. I settled into a routine, learned which floorboards creaked, and stopped noticing most of the building's little noises. Then one night, while I was brushing my teeth, I heard something above me. It wasn't footsteps. It sounded more like a piece of cardboard being dragged slowly across wood. I stopped brushing and listened. The sound stopped too. I remember standing there with toothpaste in my mouth, waiting for it to start again. When it didn't, I told myself it was probably a squirrel, a pipe shifting, or noise carrying from another apartment. About a week later, I heard it again. This time it lasted longer. I grabbed the broom from the kitchen and tapped the handle against the ceiling. Nothing answered. The next morning, there was a thin layer of gray dust on one corner of the sink. I wiped it away without thinking much about it. The bathroom door also had a habit of drifting open because the floor wasn't level. After that, I started closing it at night, mostly because the sounds were getting annoying, more than anything genuinely frightening then. Small things begin moving a few days after that. I started noticing little things around the apartment that didn't quite match how I remembered leaving them. One morning, a kitchen cabinet was open. Another time, my bathroom towel was folded over the rack differently. Then I noticed my shampoo bottle felt much lighter than it should have. None of it was enough to scare me. If anything, I blamed myself. I had been working late, sleeping badly, and I drank sometimes on weekends. It seemed more likely that I was becoming forgetful than that anything strange was happening. When I came home the next afternoon, the bathroom light was on. That bothered me because I had been trying to keep my electric bill down, and I had gotten into the habit of checking every light before leaving. The front door was still locked. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing was missing. I called Mr. Keller and mentioned the noises again. He told me there was only a narrow construction void above the bathroom, left from when the house had been divided into apartments. Said it was too small for anyone to get into. Honestly, that made me feel better. And for several nights after that, everything went quiet again. I slept better, stopped checking the ceiling, and gradually convinced myself the whole thing had been coincidence. The phone recording a few nights later, the noises came back, and by then I had convinced myself there was some kind of animal up there. I wanted proof more than anything, mostly so I could stop thinking about it. Before leaving for an evening shift, I dug out an old phone from a drawer, plugged it in, and left an audio recording app running on the bathroom counter. I honestly expected to come home 2 hours of pipes, traffic, and nothing else. I got back, I forgot about it completely. Later that night, I remembered the phone and started skipping through the recording. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Silence. Water moving through the pipes. Cars passing outside. Then, about 2 hours after I had left, there was a dull thump. After that came several minutes of almost complete silence. Then I heard something that sounded like wood shifting against wood. And a few seconds later, there was a cough. Just once. It was faint, but human enough that I replayed it over and over. I sent the file to my sister without saying what I thought I heard. A few minutes later, she texted back and asked, "Did someone cough?" That was the first time I stopped feeling ridiculous. The ceiling panel. I called Mr. Keller the next morning and told him about the recording. I expected him to brush it off, but after a pause he said he would come by the following afternoon and take a look. Before he arrived, I noticed more gray dust around the top edge of the shower. I stepped into the tub and looked up at the rectangular outline in the ceiling. One corner seemed lower than the others, maybe half an inch. I reached up and pressed it carefully. The whole section moved. That was the moment I realized it wasn't sealed at all. It was a removable panel, painted the same color as the ceiling. I could have pushed it farther open. I didn't. I suddenly didn't want to know what was above me until someone else was there. When Mr. Keller arrived, he climbed onto a ladder and stared at the panel for a few seconds. His expression changed. He didn't look curious. He looked uncomfortable. He lifted it aside. Above the bathroom was a narrow cavity between the lowered ceiling and the original structure. According to him, there should have been almost no usable space, but it extended farther toward the rear of the house than he remembered. Near the opening, the insulation was flattened. There was a half-empty plastic water bottle, 2 cigarette filters, and a grocery store receipt. Mr. Keller picked it up and checked the date. It was 11 days old. For a moment, neither of us said anything else. I didn't smoke. He said he didn't either. We asked the tenant next door. He didn't smoke either. The part nobody could explain, we called the police after finding the receipt and cigarette filters. Their reaction was calmer than mine, which helped a little. They checked the doors, windows, rear staircase, and the space above the bathroom.
Ow.
Nothing showed obvious forced entry. One officer said the cavity seemed to run toward an old service area near the back of the building. But the renovations had created so many odd partitions that it was hard to tell what connected to what. There might have been access during construction years earlier. What nobody could explain was how someone could be getting in and out now, without opening something noticeable. I stayed at my sister's that night. The next afternoon, I went back to pack some clothes. While grabbing toiletries, I opened the bathroom cabinet and saw a cheap disposable razor on the bottom shelf. It was the same brand I used, but a different color. I'd never bought that color. Maybe it belonged to a previous tenant. Maybe it had been sitting there for months. But I remembered cleaning every shelf when I moved in. That bothered me more than anything above the ceiling. I moved out within 2 weeks. Mr. Keller later sealed the panel permanently. No one was ever identified or caught, a lingering impact. It's been years and I still can't say certainly that someone was living above me. There are too many possibilities. Maybe construction workers had left things behind. Maybe a previous tenant had found a way into that space. Maybe someone was accessing it from another part of the building. But the experience changed one habit permanently. Whenever I move somewhere new, I check attic hatches, crawl spaces, utility closets, and removable ceiling panels. I still have the recording. I almost never play it. The cough isn't the part that bothers me most. It's the 7 minutes of silence before it. If someone was up there, they were completely still, listening. Transition 1. The first story was frightening because it suggested someone might have been entering a place that was supposed to be private. The next story is different. This time, the narrator was inside a locked car, on a road she had driven many times before. Nothing touched her vehicle. Nobody tried to force her off the road. What unsettled her was simpler. She kept seeing something that should not have been where it was. And afterward, no matter how carefully she retraced the route, she could never make the timing fit. Story 2. The car at mile marker 41. I was 28 when this happened. And by then, I had made that drive so many times, I could almost do it without thinking. Most Sundays I had dinner at my parents' place, and left sometime after 8 for the 90-minute trip back to my apartment. It was mostly a rural highway, the kind of route where nothing really changes. I usually listened to podcasts, stopped at the same gas station for coffee if I was tired, called my boyfriend through the car's hands-free system for part of the drive. I wasn't someone who got nervous easily. If anything, I was probably too practical about things. Strange noises had explanations. People behaved oddly sometimes. Cars broke down. Roads looked different at night. What mattered later was how well I knew that route. There was an abandoned feed store with a faded red sign, then a narrow bridge where the road dipped slightly. A few miles after that was a small church with a bright white sign that always stood out after dark. Then came mile marker 41. It sat beside a long stretch of pine trees with almost nothing around it. I always knew exactly when I was there, too, the parked SUV. That Sunday in November, I left my parents' house later than usual. We had stayed at the table talking after dinner, and by the time I pulled onto the highway, it was close to 10. The weather was cold but clear, and once I got beyond town, traffic thinned out quickly. When I reached mile marker 41, I saw a dark SUV pulled partly onto the shoulder. Its hazard lights were off. The driver's door looked open, and someone was standing near the back of it. I slowed a little because my first thought was that they might need help. The person didn't wave or step toward the road. He just stood there, facing the traffic as I passed. Since I was alone, I kept going. For the next few miles, I felt a little guilty about it. I remember thinking maybe I should have stopped or called someone. Then I reached the red light in the next small town. I checked my mirrors. There was nobody behind me. At that point, nothing about the encounter felt especially strange. Seeing it again. About 20 minutes later, I turned onto another road and saw a dark SUV parked ahead on the shoulder. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then I got closer. It had the same boxy shape as the one near mile marker 41. Same dark color. And there was someone standing near the rear again. It was the first moment I felt genuinely uneasy. My brain immediately started trying to explain it. Maybe the SUV had passed me while I was distracted. Maybe there were two similar vehicles on the same stretch of road. Maybe I was remembering the first one wrong, but I kept coming back to the same problem. After passing the first SUV, I had checked my rearview mirror more than once. No vehicle had come up behind me, and there were long open sections where I would have noticed someone overtaking me. I called my boyfriend. I didn't tell him I thought I was being followed because, honestly, I wasn't ready to say that out loud. I made it sound like a joke instead, telling him I had just seen the same creepy SUV twice. He laughed at first. Then he asked where I was. He stayed on the phone after that, just talking. The route changes my boyfriend suggested I get off the back roads and take the longer route toward the interstate. It added about 15 minutes, but there would be more traffic, more lights, and more places to stop if I needed to. I agreed, mostly because hearing him say it made me realize I was more nervous than I wanted to admit. After a few turns, I started to relax. The road widened, and I told myself I had probably connected to completely unrelated things. Then I noticed headlights behind me. They were several hundred feet back, far enough that I couldn't tell what kind of vehicle it was. It wasn't riding my bumper or flashing its lights. It just stayed there. That was what really bothered me. I sped up a little. The headlights seemed to speed up too. At the next intersection, I slowed earlier than necessary. So did they. My boyfriend told me not to go home. We found a 24-hour pharmacy near the interstate, and I started driving toward it. A few minutes before I reached the commercial area, I checked the mirror again. The headlights were gone. I remember feeling almost embarrassed. I told myself I had scared myself into seeing a pattern that wasn't there at all. The third appearance, by the time I got near the pharmacy, I had mostly convinced myself I was overreacting. To reach it, I had to pass beneath an overpass and stop at a light where a closed furniture store sat across the intersection. While I was waiting, I looked toward the parking lot. There was a dark SUV parked near the entrance. Its headlights were off. I couldn't see whether anyone was inside. I didn't wait around long enough to decide if it was the same vehicle. The second the light changed, I drove straight into the pharmacy parking lot and parked as close to the front doors as I could. My boyfriend was still on the phone, and I stayed on with him until I got inside. I told one of the employees what had been happening. I remember feeling stupid explaining it because I had no proof anyone had actually followed me. Still, she was kind about it and told me I could wait near the front as long as I needed. I stayed there for about 40 minutes. Every few minutes, I had found myself looking through the pharmacy windows anyway. Eventually, my boyfriend drove out to meet me. When we walked outside together, I looked across the intersection again. The SUV was gone. We drove back to my apartment in separate cars, with him following behind me the entire way. Nothing else happened that night, but I barely slept. What the map revealed. The next morning, my boyfriend came over, and we pulled up the route on a map. I think we expected that once we looked at it in daylight, the whole thing would make sense. It didn't. The first place I remembered seeing the SUV and the second place were far enough apart that, using the normal roads, it should have taken longer to get there than it took me. The only way that timing worked was if the SUV had left before I passed it the first time. But I had seen someone standing beside it. Then we noticed something else. The road where I saw it the second time wasn't even directly on my usual route. There was a shortcut locals sometimes used, but part of it was an unpaved maintenance road. We found a county notice saying that road was supposed to be gated during that season. Supposed to be. That still left plenty of ordinary explanations. Maybe I had mistaken two similar SUVs for the same one. Maybe the gate had been open. Maybe I remembered the timing wrong because I was nervous. In the end, I never reported anything. No one had threatened me. No one had approached my car. All I really had was a route, a few sightings, and a feeling I couldn't prove. The photograph a few weeks later. I was scrolling through photos on my phone when I found one I had taken at my parents' house that night. It was a picture of their dog sitting near the front window. Then I noticed something outside. Across the street, cut off by the edge of the photo, was a dark vehicle. I couldn't tell the make or model. It could have belonged to a neighbor, and my parents didn't recognize it when I showed them. What bothered me was the timing. I'd taken that picture shortly before leaving. The first SUV appeared almost 40 minutes later. Maybe they weren't connected, I don't know. Lingering impact. I still drive that road sometimes, but only during the day. I won't take it alone at night. Whenever I pass a vehicle stopped on a shoulder, I hesitate. A part of me thinks someone might need help. Then I remember the person beside the SUV. I never saw their face. What I remember is how still they stood while I approached and passed, as if they weren't waiting for help, as if they were checking which car had gone by. Transition to the first two stories had one thing in common. Eventually, the people telling them could leave. An apartment can be abandoned. A road can be avoided. Distance can make a bad memory feel smaller. The third subscriber told me that was the part he used to envy. His experience happened inside the house where his family still lives. There was no unfamiliar highway to stay away from, no landlord to call, no lease to end. It was home. And that made what happened there much harder to put behind him. Story 3, what my son kept under his bed. I was 35 when we bought the house, and for the first time in years, it felt like we had finally settled somewhere for good. My wife and I had spent most of our marriage renting, moving whenever a lease ended or the rent went up, so owning an older house in a quiet suburb felt almost unreal. We loved it immediately. There was a small backyard, a little breakfast nook off the kitchen, and an elderly couple next door who introduced themselves before we had finished unloading the truck. Our son was 6 then, and choosing his bedroom was the biggest decision in the world to him. He picked the room with the low window facing the narrow side yard between our house and the neighbors. He was imaginative, but not an especially nervous kid. He loved dinosaurs, drew complicated machines, he said, could dig to the center of the earth, lined his toys up in neat rows across the floor. Sometimes he asked us to leave the hallway light on at night, but we never thought much of it. For a while, that room was just another happy part of the house. Saturday mornings meant pancakes in the breakfast nook. His school shoes usually ended up by the front door. Cartoons played while my wife worked at the kitchen table. Looking back, that normal feeling is what makes the rest of it so difficult to remember. Nothing about the house felt wrong at first. Not even slightly. The night game a few months after we moved in, our son started waking up tired. At first, we blamed school. He had a new teacher, a longer day, and the weather was getting colder, so none of it seemed unusual. Then my wife mentioned that she had heard him moving around after midnight. The next morning, we asked why he had been out of bed, said he was playing the night game. That sounded like something a 6-year-old would invent, so I asked what the game was. He told me he waited until the hallway got quiet, then climbed down beside his bed and lay on the floor listening. I asked what he was listening for. 3 little sounds, he said. And if he heard them, he was supposed to stay quiet. At the time, that didn't scare me. Old houses make noises, pipes knock, heating systems click, neighbors drop things. We told him nighttime was for sleeping, not games. He shrugged, said okay, and went back to eating his cereal. That easy reaction reassured us more than anything. That nothing about it felt frightening yet, or even especially strange to us. The side window. A few days later, I got up before sunrise and noticed the curtains in my son's room were open. That caught my attention because he hated sleeping with them open. He always said the window looked too dark at night, so either my wife or I usually closed them before bed. I asked if he had opened them. He said no. Then he added that sometimes they were already open when he woke up. My first thought was that the fabric was slipping, so I tightened the brackets and made sure everything was secure. A few days after that, I noticed mud on the outside sill beneath his window. Again, there was an easy explanation. We had raccoons in the neighborhood. Cats wandered through the yards, and I had been doing some work along that side of the house. The window was locked from the inside. The screen wasn't torn. Nothing looked damaged. So I cleaned the mud off and completely forgot about it. Looking back, that was probably the first point when separate little things started becoming a pattern. At the time, though, I saw them as separate things. The drawings a few days later, my wife was cleaning our son's room when she found a stack of drawings under his desk. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect from a 6-year-old. Our house, the 3 of us standing in the yard. A dog he kept asking us to get. But in several of the pictures, there was the same shape beside his bedroom window. It was just a tall rectangle with 3 black dots near the top. That evening, we asked him about it as casually as we could. He pointed at the shape and said, "That's where he waits." I asked who he meant. He looked confused, almost like he thought we already knew. Then he said the person wasn't his friend and wasn't allowed to come inside. That was the first time I felt something in my stomach drop. I asked if a grown-up had been talking to him. He said only through the window. My wife and I checked the side yard. We looked around the fence, the window, the narrow strip between our house and the neighbors. Nothing seemed disturbed. The next morning, we spoke with his teacher in the school office. Nobody had noticed anyone around him. By then, the drawings didn't feel imaginary anymore. They felt like evidence of something we had missed. Practical explanations first. I still wanted there to be a normal explanation, so I treated it like a practical problem. I installed a motion light outside my son's window and added a second lock to the frame. Then we asked the couple next door if they had noticed anyone walking between the houses. They hadn't. The husband mentioned that delivery drivers sometimes cut through the side yards. Nothing he described sounded suspicious. Kept thinking maybe our son had seen a teenager, a utility worker, or one of the neighbors outside once, and turned it into a story. Kids do that. They mix real things with imagination all the time. For almost 2 weeks, nothing happened. He slept normally. The curtains stayed closed.
Ow.
We stopped checking the yard every few minutes. My wife and I even started feeling embarrassed about how seriously we had reacted. Then one morning, I noticed the motion light wasn't working. When I checked it, the bulb had been unscrewed just enough to lose contact. Wind couldn't have done that. Still, I told myself maybe I hadn't tightened it properly when I installed it. So I screwed it back in and tested it twice before going inside again. The object under the bed that Saturday, my wife was changing our son's bedding when she called me into his room. She was kneeling beside the bed with something in her hand. It was a small plastic flashlight. Cheap, scratched, and not one I recognized. She asked our son where it came from. He looked at it and said, "That's the window man's." Everything in the room seemed to change after that. We asked how he got it, but his answers came out in pieces. He said the man told him to keep it because the backyard gets dark. Said he had been given it through the window. I asked if the man had ever come inside. Shook his head immediately. No, he's not allowed. That was the point where imagination stopped being enough of an explanation for me. We called the police. 2 officers came out and checked the window, the side yard, the fence, and the area beneath the sill. There was no sign of forced entry. The screen could technically be removed from outside, but the glass itself still locked securely from inside. They took the flashlight and looked it over. There was no name on it, no label, nothing useful. It was just a cheap flashlight. But someone had put it under my son's bed. Neither my wife nor I could explain how it had gotten into room. The night father stayed awake that night. I decided to sleep in my son's room. I didn't tell him why. I didn't want him thinking there was definitely something outside his window, especially if all of this still had some harmless explanation. He slept in our bed with my wife, and I lay awake in his room with the lights off. For hours, nothing happened. The house settled. The refrigerator clicked on in the kitchen. A car passed somewhere down the street. Then, sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard a faint metallic tap. A few seconds later, another, then a third. It wasn't against the glass. It sounded lower, closer to the exterior wall beneath the window. I stayed completely still. Maybe 30 seconds passed before the motion light outside suddenly came on. I got up slowly and moved toward the curtain. Before I touched it, I heard a soft scraping sound from the side yard. I pulled the curtain aside. There was nobody at the window. For a second, I felt ridiculous. Then I looked toward the end of the yard. The side gate was moving slowly back and forth. I called the police again. Officers searched around the house and the nearby street, but they didn't find anyone. After they left, I stayed awake until morning. What stayed with me most? The gate had been latched before I went to bed. The neighbor's camera the next afternoon. Our neighbor across the street came over and mentioned that his driveway camera caught part of the road in front of our house. It didn't show the side yard, but we went through several nights of footage anyway. On 2 different nights, sometime after midnight, a person walked past our driveway toward the narrow space between our house and the property next door. The image quality was terrible. I couldn't see a face, clothing details, or anything that could identify them. There was no clear footage of the person leaving, but there was another way out behind the houses, so that didn't prove much. The police took copies of the clips, but nothing came from it. After that, we added more lights, secured the gate, and installed our own cameras. The person never appeared again. That should have made me feel better. It didn't, not at all. The detail their son mentioned years later, years passed before my son mentioned any of it again. By then, he was older, and my wife and I had made a point of not bringing up the window, the flashlight, or the camera footage. We didn't want to influence what he remembered. One evening, during an unrelated conversation, he suddenly said, "Do you remember the man by my old bedroom?" I asked what he remembered, careful not to give him details. He said not much, and he mentioned something he had never told us before. The man knew his first name. I asked how he knew that. My son shrugged. He said he remembered hearing it whispered through the screen. Then he added one more thing. The man had told him not to wake us because your dad gets angry when he's tired. That sentence stayed with me, because it didn't sound imagined. It sounded observed, like someone had watched our family long enough to learn our routines. Lingering ending, we owned the house, and my son moved into another bedroom. Nothing like it happened again. I don't believe anything supernatural was involved. What scares me is the explanation. Someone may have stood outside my 6-year-old son's window at night. They may have spoken to him more than once. They may have known our routines. Because nothing was stolen and nobody was hurt, we never learned who it was or what they wanted. The police eventually returned the flashlight. I sealed it inside a box in the garage. Every few years, I see that box while looking for something else. I never open it. Not because the flashlight scares me, because I wonder how much that person knew about us. Explanations we never get. There are possible explanations for all 3 stories. The first could have been an old building with access nobody fully understood. The second could have been coincidence, bad timing, or 2 similar vehicles mistaken for one. The third may have been a trespasser who stopped coming around once the family added lights and cameras. But a possible explanation is not the same thing as knowing what happened. Nobody pulled off a mask. Nobody confessed. Nobody explained the sounds above the bathroom, the SUV on the road, or the person outside a child's window. Life simply continued. The tenant moved away. The driver changed the route she took at night. The father checked locks, added cameras, and kept watching the windows. Years passed, but each person carried something small forward with them. One still checks ceiling panels. One watches every stopped vehicle on a dark shoulder. One makes sure the windows near his children are secure. Maybe that is why unresolved stories stay with us at all. Sometimes the most disturbing experiences are not the ones where people discover exactly what was watching them. They are the ones where people eventually become safe without ever learning what they became safe from.